Okay, everyone, this is the video lecture for Chapter 15 on sex and reproductive success. This chapter will deal largely with the question of why, from an evolutionary perspective, sexual reproduction even exists at all, as opposed to asexual reproduction. We'll also dive into questions concerning any potential conflicts between males and females in terms of their respective means of achieving maximum lifetime reproductive success. Okay? So we know organisms reproduce in a diversity of ways. Some species consist of the typical female-male genetic system of reproduction. Others use a genetic system in which individuals self-fertilize or maybe consist of one sex only. So the question is then, why do different genetic systems exist for reproduction? Well, since we know that group selection is a weak evolutionary force, we discovered in a previous chapter that individual selection is stronger. Is it possible for individual selection to give rise to the various genetic systems? Okay, let's define a few things first. So, sex is defined as the union of two gametes. The technical term for this is syngamy. Okay, this is union of two gametes. So, a sperm and egg fuse during fertilization, and you get a fertilized egg, a zygote. All right, and again, these gametes are produced through meiosis. And this involves a reduction division, so a cutting in half of chromosome numbers so that sperm only have a single copy of every chromosome, and eggs also only have a single copy. That way, when they unite during fertilization, you go back to the diploid number, where you have two copies of each chromosome. So, during this process then of fertilization or fusion of gametes, we have recombination among loci, and we also have segregation of alleles. So the segregation of alleles part refers to the fact that two copies of the same gene or two alleles for the same gene will separate away from each other during gamete formation, meiosis. That's the reduction division part. And then they'll recombine in new combinations, recombination in the next generation when a sperm fertilizes an egg. So you can get new combinations of alleles for a gene that may have never existed before. And again, this produces a large amount of genetic variation. Excuse me. So sexual species nearly always consist of two distinct sexes. The technical term for that condition or situation is dioecious. That means two separate sexes, all right? And so each of these sexes will produce gametes, distinctive gametes, sperm and egg typically, of different size. And the fact that those gametes are of such different sizes and look so different physically, that is a situation referred to as anisogamy, all right? So syngamy, again, is the fusion of gametes. Dioecious is when you have individuals of distinct sexes, and anisogamy is when those distinct sexes produce gametes that are of usually dramatically different size and appearance. Okay, so species in which individuals are capable of producing both types of gametes are called hermaphroditic. So in some species you have hermaphrodites where a single individual can produce both what we would think of as male and female gametes. You can think of a hermaphrodite as having both male and female sexual organs, and they do. Now, asexual reproduction, that's reproduction without syngamy, without fusion of distinct gametes, can occur in a variety of different ways. In plants, for example, offspring may be produced vegetatively as a group of cells, usually called stolons or runners, that spread away from the parent individual. And they will develop into carbon copies, genetic duplicates of the original parent, clones, in other words. Asexual reproduction may also occur by parthenogenesis, also referred to as virgin birth, in which a new offspring develops from a single unfertilized egg. The offspring here, again, is also genetically identical to the mother, except for any mutations that may have occurred. Let me write that down. So parthenogenesis. Again, this is referred to as virgin birth. Some salamanders do this, some fish do this, a variety of other species as well. Okay. All right. So now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about what's widely referred to as the paradox of sex. When you look at most species today, most species that we see around us today, whether they're plant, animal, fungi, protist, whatever, generally reproduce sexually, meaning that the offspring gets distinct sets of DNA from two different parents. Okay, that's the biological definition of sex, is the recombination in the offspring of two parents' sets of DNA. And the advantage of sexual reproduction is usually attributed to the greater genetic variability it causes compared to asexual reproduction, and this should increase the rate of adaptive evolution and thus decrease the likelihood of extinction. So that's always sort of thrown out there as the primary reason why sexual reproduction is so prevalent compared to asexual, okay, is that it produces so much genetic variability and allows sexual species to adapt much more quickly to changing conditions and therefore persist longer without going extinct. So, evidence for this comes from the observation that most extant lineages, those that currently exist, are in fact sexual lineages. And the few asexual lineages that we see around us emerged recently from sexual ancestors. So if we take a look at these dandelions here, okay, this is a great example of that very thing. Newly arisen asexual lineages that we see around us today often still possess sexual characteristics that their sexual ancestors or closely related sexual species use for a specific sexual function. And we can see that very clearly with plants such as dandelions. So dandelions reproduce by apomixis. Okay, you see that term right there, apomixis. In other words, an unfertilized female egg. But they still do retain sexual characteristics, such as the bright coloration that you see there for attracting insect pollinators. They have non-functional stamens. So the fact that they have stamens and that they have the bright coloration suggests that their ancestors reproduced sexually, as modern sexual species of flowering plants do. So this strongly suggests asexual reproduction evolved recently in this clade or in this group of plants. All right, so this evidence suggests that most asexual lineages that emerged in the past are now extinct since we see so few of them today. In other words, sexual reproduction may reduce the likelihood of extinction, and this suggests that group selection, as we discussed in the previous chapter, may be responsible for the prevalence of sex. But that's controversial. Okay, so let's talk about potential disadvantages of sex. We've named the primary advantage, which is the genetic variability that it results in. But what about disadvantages? Well, there are a number of possible disadvantages here. First, recombination that we see during sexual reproduction has the capacity to disrupt what are called co-adapted gene complexes through linkage disequilibrium breakdown. We saw in the previous chapter how linkage disequilibrium is eventually eroded away by continued future rounds of sexual recombination. So, any allele that we might have or that a species might have that increases the frequency of recombination may actually decrease in frequency because it can end up in gene combinations that reduce fitness, and so those gene combinations get selected against, and they take those alleles for increased frequency of recombination with them. So as an example of this, if we look at this figure from your text, if you look at this figure, we have two different alleles. We have, let's say, an allele R, uppercase R, call it dominant for some gene, that suppresses recombination. And the recessive version of that gene, allele lowercase r, promotes recombination. Okay, so we have an asexual species reproducing here on top and a sexual species reproducing here on the bottom. Or you can think of these as lineages within the same species or whatever. So up here on top, you see we have two copies of the dominant allele, okay? And because these individuals reproduce to make offspring genetically identical to themselves, as you see in both cases here, these genotypes are identical to that one, these two identical to that one, we end up with 4 copies of that dominant allele. In other words, it's fixed. Everybody has it. That was also true in the parent generation. You only had the dominant allele there. All right. Now, what if we have a sexual species where you have the lowercase or the recessive allele promoting recombination? Okay. Well, now you see that we have both parents having that, all right? But it's possible that through recombination, we end up with, let's say, two offspring genotypes that are not fit, okay? They're just not fit in the given environment, whatever, and they're selected against. These individuals never go on to reproduce. Well, the other two are fit, so they're just like the original parents. Well, of these four offspring, then, two of them don't go on to reproduce, so these parents, these sexual parents here, only produced two offspring that went on to be successful in their own reproduction. So that means that in the next generation, compared to the parents, that allele that promotes recombination did not increase in frequency because two of the four copies of it ended up in gene complexes that were not well adapted. And so the recessive allele there that does promote recombination in those two cases was selected against. All right. So, second thing is the apparent cost of sex. Okay, cost of sex, as it's called. Asexual species are capable of producing more offspring than our sexual species, and that is largely true across the board. Think about it. An asexual female will produce all female offspring. They're going to be clones of her because there's no recombination going on. But a sexual female with the same fecundity will produce only half as many females, and the reason for that is because she produces males, typically as half of her offspring. And males, while they can contribute to reproduction, they can participate in the process, males, in most cases, cannot give birth or lay eggs. So they're not producing offspring directly. So if we look over here at the asexual female, right, and let's say she has this genotype here, doesn't really matter, but she has that genotype, and she produces cloned female offspring, 4 of them. So she's produced 4, and then each of them goes on to produce 4 more themselves. So after 2 generations, you have 16 offspring clones of the original grandparent in that case. Now, in the case of sexual recombination, we have a sexual female here and a sexual male. So it takes 2 to produce offspring in the case of a sexual species. And so on average, they'll produce 2 females and 2 males. So 1-to-1 ratio, 50-50 female versus male offspring. So right off the bat, in the second generation, or the first generation off the parent generation, we only have 2 female offspring in this example, whereas over here we had 4. Now, those 2 females can produce 4 more offspring, but again, on average, half of them will be male. So in the next generation, the F2 compared to the original parent generation, we only have 4 female offspring, whereas here we had 16. So the fact that males are produced and males are necessary to produce the other gamete, but cannot reproduce directly, that's referred to as the 50% cost of sex. All right, 50% cost of sex. And that also is often cited as one of the major downsides to sexual reproduction. Okay, so that cost of sex means that an asexual genotype should increase in frequency twice as fast as a sexual genotype, meaning that a new asexual mutant allele should be fixed very rapidly in a sexual population. So you would think that eventually that sexual or asexual mutant allele would just run rampant and go to fixation and completely drive all the sexual genotypes to extinction. And that's possible, theoretically. So if that's the case, why then, when we look at species present today on the planet, why do we see so few asexual species? Why so many sexual species when a single sexual individual produces half as many offspring each generation as an asexual individual? That is the paradox of sex. Okay, that's the paradox of sex. All right, so there are a number of explanations or hypothetical explanations that have been thrown out there as actual hypotheses. So for an explanation of the commonness of sexual reproduction may then lie in what short-term advantages it may have that may actually outweigh these disadvantages that we've talked about. The first one that we'll talk about is referred to as Mueller's ratchet hypothesis. Okay, Mueller's ratchet hypothesis. This is one of these explanations or proposed explanations for why it is we have this paradox of sex, why it is that sexual reproduction is so common compared to asexual. And this Mueller's ratchet hypothesis basically argues that, or rather suggests, that it prevents mutational meltdown. So sexual reproduction prevents mutational meltdown. All right. So an asexual population may have multiple deleterious mutations, bad mutations, and therefore multiple genotypes carrying different numbers of mutations, from 0 mutations to as many mutations as actually exist in the population. In an asexual species, because there's no recombination, progeny cannot possibly have fewer mutations than their parents, but they can have more due to random mutations that occurred as those progeny were produced from their parents, again, asexually. Now, as mutations continue to accumulate in the population, genotypes with fewer mutations that are better adapted gradually decline in frequency, and as they become more rare, drift then increases the chances that these low mutation genotypes will be lost. Remember, the more rare a genotype, the more likely it is to be lost by drift. So by this process, genotypes gradually accumulate mutations, and this process is irreversible, like a ratchet. Think about a ratchet and socket set. So it's irreversible like a ratchet due to a lack of recombination. So recombination is not present in asexual species, and it cannot disrupt bad gene complexes and get rid of bad alleles. They stick around and accumulate and become ever more common as the generations go by because of a lack of recombination. So, as mutations accumulate in genotypes, the fitness of the population declines, and that is called, again, mutational meltdown. And that's what this figure is showing you. So what you see here is, say, time 1, the beginning of the time under consideration here for this population, and you see the frequency distribution curve for the number of mutations. And you see the average number of mutations is somewhere around 3, all right? So this is frequency of occurrence of bad mutations, all right? Now, because mutations are random and they're accidents that occur as DNA is replicated, potentially each generation, subsequent generations into the future, you can expect that in an asexual species, the mean number of mutations will increase over time because there's no way to recombine and get rid of those mutations, all right? They build up. That's the ratchet part, the Mueller's ratchet part. And eventually you get to a point, or the population gets to a point, where there are so many deleterious mutations that the population as a whole becomes less fit and might ultimately lead to extinction. That's the mutational meltdown part, due to accumulation of these deleterious mutations. In comparison, recombination in sexually reproducing species reconstitutes the most adaptive genotypes, those that have the least mutation load, by producing offspring with new combinations of favorable alleles. That's the key point, the recombination that can produce new combinations of favorable alleles just by random chance alone. So a related hypothesis states that deleterious mutations at multiple loci will be eliminated more rapidly by sexual reproduction, since recombination will bring them together so they can be eliminated at the same time. All right, so these mechanisms then may compensate for the cost of sex. Another explanation for why it is that sex is so prevalent amongst most species today, and that is the adaptation to fluctuating environments. So a changing environment means different genotypes are more fit, or most fit rather, at different times. So, excuse me, imagine that balancing selection favors the following genotypes. Okay, heterozygote for A, someone that's heterozygous for B, heterozygous for C, and heterozygous for D. So that's a genotype of 4 different genes. That individual is heterozygous for all 4 of those. All right, and so selection or balancing selection is favoring that genotype, but it's also favoring this genotype, let's say. So an individual who is homozygous, either recessive or dominant for those same 4 genes. Now, assume that these additively increase a trait. The more dominance an individual has, the farther they are to one extreme of the phenotypic continuum, which is being selected for. The more recessives they have, the farther they are to the other extreme of that phenotypic continuum, which is also being selected for. All right, assume that's the case. If the environment were to change in such a way that, let's say, an individual with this genotype, homozygous recessive for all four genes, were favored, that genotype would not exist in an asexual species where you have this parent and that type of parent. There's no way that these individuals reproducing asexually could ever produce that genotype. All right? They're going to produce clones of themselves which would have exactly the same genotype that the parents do. But recombination in a sexual species could actually produce that genotype, because the way the alleles come back together or recombine in the next generation in a sexual species is completely random. So you will eventually get all possible combinations of the alleles from the parent generation. Now, that means that a sexual population then, because they could produce a better adapted genotype in one generation through recombination, can adapt more quickly and to more possible environmental changes than an asexual species could. An environment, however, would need to change frequently, however, since a stable environment would eventually cause the recessive alleles A, B, C, and D to become fixed. Okay, so constantly fluctuating environments will determine what's adaptive in this generation versus the next, and it won't always be the same thing. So, sexual reproduction may be favored via this mechanism through what are referred to as host-parasite interactions. In a population, let's say, that's being attacked by some sort of parasite, resistant host genotypes become more common because they're less susceptible to parasite attack. Since susceptible genotypes decrease, so then would the parasitic genotypes capable of attacking those susceptible host genotypes. The new resistant host genotypes then become more fit. Now, if a new parasite capable of attacking the resistant host then evolves, it would then be more fit and become more common. And the less common host would then become more fit because the parasite had shifted to another genotype of the host that it could then attack. So this type of coevolution between parasites and their hosts may select for sex, which can rapidly and continually regenerate rare and also possibly adaptive allele combinations. So in this figure, what you're seeing are data suggesting that these host-parasite interactions might actually favor sexual reproduction, and these studies were looking at snails and their trematode parasites. So the snails are the hosts here, and the trematodes are the parasite. So first of all, we see here in panel A, you have the abundance of the parasite, so less abundant, more abundant. And on the y-axis, you have the proportion of population made up of females. So important point here, fewer females in a population indicates more sexual genotypes, right? In asexual species, we think of the individuals as being female. So in a population where you have mostly females, that's going to be a population probably, by and large, reproducing asexually. In a population where the number of females is declining or has gone down over time, you end up getting more males. That suggests that sexual reproduction is going on. And there's some species that can switch back and forth between these modes. Some snails can do this, for instance, like you see here. So what we see is that, excuse me, as the abundance of our parasite, trematode parasite, goes up, the proportion of females in the snail population goes down. That means that the population is shifting to a sexual mode of reproduction once it begins to be attacked by the parasite. And again, the reason for this, theoretically, is that sexual reproduction produces more genotypes, different kinds of genotypes, and so you would have the population evolving faster and eventually hitting on something that's less susceptible to the parasite. Now, in panel B, what you see over here, asexual genotypes. Here we have infection rates, so low versus high, and here we have common genotypes on the left and a rare genotype on the right. And so rare genotypes, excuse me, in this case would seem to be at a selective advantage. You see how they are less susceptible, they have lower infection rates, and this is suggesting that, well, the trematode, the parasite in this case, on these snails, is adapting to the most abundant genotype. The most abundant one is probably the one that's least, at least initially, able to resist attack by the parasite. But then as the population shifts and become over toward a more sexual mode of reproduction, you'll start to get a larger and larger proportion of the population that eventually becomes resistant. But initially, those genotypes that are resulting from sexual recombination or reproduction are rare. And you see that they have a lower infection rate. All right. So now, as the last part of this first part of this video for Chapter 15, let's talk about sexual selection. So sexual selection is natural selection for mating success. The concept was introduced by Charles Darwin as a type of natural selection, and he cited sexual selection as the explanation for the often really conspicuous features of males, such as horns, antlers, very bright conspicuous coloration, elaborate courtship displays, etc. So sexual selection was Darwin's explanation for those behaviors or features of males primarily. Sexual selection explains why these kinds of features evolve. So to understand this, we have to understand something about the different reproductive strategies of males and females of the same species. These strategies of males and females result automatically in sort of a conflict between the sexes, all right? So why is this? Well, think about a male. A male can mate with a number of females. So if he happens to mate with a female that has low fitness, this one instance is not likely to significantly reduce his lifetime reproductive success. She's one of potentially many females that he may mate with over his lifetime. In contrast, however, theoretically, all of a female's eggs can be fertilized by one male because males make so many sperm. So, mating with an unfit male can dramatically lower a female's fitness. Eggs are expensive, sperm are cheap, as the saying goes. Also, because females are often less abundant in a mating pool of individuals, females have little opportunity to mate repeatedly during one breeding season, for example, they are a limiting resource for males. When a female is pregnant, she is not capable typically of becoming pregnant again until that pregnancy ends. So she may be able to mate, but there's no result of that in terms of producing more offspring while she's currently pregnant with one. Males, therefore, must compete for females. All right? But males are not a limiting resource for females. This means females, generally speaking, compete for males less intensely than males compete for females. This ultimately means that males have greater variation in mating success than do females because they're competing with other males much more intensively for access to the opposite sex than females are. Some males are very successful, others may contribute hardly at all to the next generation. And that's what you see in this figure. So in this figure, we see on the x-axis 140 seals ranked in order of their reproductive success. So we have both males and females here, most successful on the left, least successful on the right. And here we have the number of weaned pups for these individuals who are involved in or who are in the mating pool of this seal population. What you see is that a few females produce maybe upwards of 10 weaned pups in a given, I'm not sure if this is probably over their lifetime, I would imagine. And you can see that some produce, maybe 8, 7, 6, 5, whatever. And there are some down here that don't produce any for various reasons, didn't live long enough or whatever. But a good number of these females, maybe upwards of half the population, actually end up producing a number of offspring. Now, compare that to males. In males, it may be just a few individuals, 4, 5, 6, maybe 7, that produce the entirety of the weaned pups over a given amount of time. And so you may have only 10 or 9 individual males of potentially, 60 or 70, let's say, that are involved in reproduction. The rest of them are completely unsuccessful. And again, this is suggesting that males are competing much more intensively with each other for access to females than females are competing for males. In fact, in the case of seals, females don't compete for males at all. So usually we have a dominant male that controls a harem of females here, and that's why you get such a disproportionate number of pups from just a few number of males. All right, so large variation in mating success among males is a measure of the intensity of sexual selection. Sex role reversal in some species actually occurs, and here we have role reversals taking the form of males caring for young, while females compete for access to males. Females, in this case, produce more offspring than a single male can care for, so females have multiple mates. So in some cases, we have this sort of, expected dynamic between males and females actually flipped on its head. Here we have an example of sex role reversal in some shorebirds called phalaropes, okay? And what you see here, these are two females. These are two females competing with each other for access to the male. Notice how the male in this case is fairly drab in coloration, smaller in body size than the females. The females are brightly colored, larger in body size, and competing with each other for access to that male. That's a sex role reversal. On the right-hand side, we have a male seahorse actually giving birth, okay? So we do have some sort of extreme examples of sex role reversal, but by and large, most species, follow the typical male-female pattern that we're most accustomed to. All right, so I'm going to stop there for the first part of this video lecture, and we'll pick up with the second half in the next lecture.